Bullies bring a knife to stab the new student. Big mistake. He was a brutal fighter. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the chain-link fence surrounding Lincoln High School as 17-year-old Adrian Volkov shouldered his weathered canvas backpack and approached the imposing brick facade that would serve as his academic prison for the next 8 months. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with a lean build that bordered on skinny, Adrian possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that typically allowed teenagers to blend seamlessly into the background of high school social hierarchies. His dark hair fell in unruly waves across his forehead, partially obscuring intelligent grey eyes that held depths most people never bothered to explore. The worn jeans and faded black hoodie he wore spoke of a family budget stretched thin, while his quiet demeanor and slightly accented English marked him as unmistakably foreign in a school where conformity ruled supreme. What none of his soon-to-be classmates could possibly know was that beneath Adrian's unassuming exterior lay 8 years of intensive training in Systema, the brutal Russian martial art that emphasized fluidity, breath control, and the efficient neutralization of threats through whatever means necessary. His father, Dmitry Volkov, had been a sergeant in the Russian Special Forces before immigrating to America, and he had passed down not only his combat knowledge, but also his unwavering philosophy about violence as a last resort. The calluses on Adrian's knuckles were hidden beneath long sleeves, the scars from countless sparring sessions concealed by careful positioning, and the deadly precision of his movements masked by a deliberately awkward teenage gait. Adrian's family had moved to the small town of Riverside following his father's job transfer to a local manufacturing plant, leaving behind their comfortable life in Chicago, where Adrian had attended a diverse magnet school where his mixed heritage and quiet nature had never made him a target. His mother, Elena, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner to supplement their income, while his younger sister, Katya, struggled with her own adjustment to their new environment at the middle school across town. The Volkovs lived in a modest apartment complex on the wrong side of the tracks, where the American dream felt more like a daily struggle for survival. Lincoln High School dominated the center of Riverside like a red brick monument to traditional American values, its corridors lined with trophy cases celebrating decades of football victories and homecoming queens. The student body of roughly 800 pupils represented a fairly homogeneous slice of Middle America, with the occasional splash of diversity provided by the children of immigrant families who had settled in the area for manufacturing jobs. The social hierarchy was as rigid and predictable as any high school caste system, with athletes and cheerleaders occupying the apex, followed by honor students, theater kids, band members, and finally the outcasts who survived by maintaining absolute invisibility. The undisputed king of Lincoln High's social pyramid was Brett Hammond, an 18-year-old senior who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and carried himself with the casual arrogance that came from 4 years of dominating both the football field and the student body. His perfectly styled blonde hair caught the fluorescent hallway lighting like a golden crown, while his broad shoulders and athletic build filled out his Letterman jacket in a way that made freshman girls giggle and teachers look the other way when he bent minor rules. Brett's father owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, ensuring that his son drove a different expensive vehicle to school every few weeks and never wanted for spending money or influence with local authority figures. Brett's inner circle consisted of 3 loyal lieutenants who had basked in his reflected glory since middle school. Chase Morrison, the quarterback whose arm strength had earned him a full scholarship to a Division II college, possessed the kind of cruel intelligence that made him more dangerous than his mere physical presence might suggest. At 6 feet even, with dirty blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, Chase had perfected the art of psychological warfare, understanding exactly which buttons to push to reduce his victims to tears without ever raising his voice above a conversational level. Tommy Rodriguez served as the group's enforcer. his compact but muscular frame and perpetually aggressive demeanor making him the perfect tool for delivering physical intimidation when psychological methods proved insufficient. Despite his Hispanic surname, Tommy had been adopted by white parents as an infant and had spent his entire life overcompensating for his ethnic appearance by being more aggressively American than his peers. His black hair was always styled in a severe crew cut, and his dark eyes held a constant edge of violence that made even other athletes think twice before crossing him. The final member of Brett's crew was Nathan Price, a tall, gangly teenager whose pale complexion and nervous energy made him seem like an unlikely member of the school's dominant clique. Nathan's inclusion in the group stemmed not from his physical prowess, but from his family's connections and his willingness to serve as the group's unofficial photographer and social media coordinator. His father worked as the town's chief of police, providing the boys with a sense of immunity from serious consequences for their actions, while Nathan's talent for technology ensured that their humiliation campaigns could extend far beyond the school grounds into the digital realm. The culture at Lincoln High had evolved over decades into a system where bullying was not only tolerated, but quietly encouraged as a form of social regulation. Teachers and administrators, many of whom had attended the school themselves, maintained a willful blindness to harassment that didn't result in hospitalization or lawsuit. The unofficial motto seemed to be that teenagers needed to work out their own problems, with adult intervention reserved only for situations that threatened the school's reputation or insurance liability. This hands-off approach had created an environment where students like Brett and his crew could operate with virtual impunity, understanding that their victims were unlikely to receive meaningful support from authority figures. Adrian's first day at Lincoln High began with the typical administrative shuffle of schedule pickup, locker assignment, and the awkward process of finding his way around an unfamiliar building. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had given him a 5-minute overview of school policies and a photocopied map of the building before dismissing him with a distracted smile and a vague encouragement to jump right in and make friends. The morning bell found Adrian standing in front of his assigned locker, struggling with a combination that refused to cooperate while streams of students flowed past him with the practiced efficiency of 4 years' experience. "Lost already, new meat?" The voice came from directly behind Adrian, causing him to turn and find himself facing Chase Morrison's predatory grin. The quarterback stood just close enough to invade personal space without making the invasion obvious to casual observers, his expensive cologne mixing with the faint scent of cigarettes and arrogance. "Let me guess, you're the Russian kid everyone's been talking about, Adrian something unpronounceable, right?" Adrian straightened slowly, his gray eyes meeting Chase's blue ones without flinching. "Adrian Volkov," he replied simply, his accent barely detectable, but enough to mark him as definitively other in Chase's mental calculations. "And you are?" Chase's grin widened at what he perceived as either incredible naivety or spectacular arrogance. "I'm Chase Morrison, starting quarterback, and the guy who decides whether your time here is going to be pleasant or extremely unpleasant. That depends entirely on how quickly you learn to show proper respect to your betters." The locker finally opened with a metallic click, and Adrian began transferring books from his backpack while mentally cataloging Chase's position, stance, and potential threat level. Years of training had taught him to assess every encounter for signs of escalation while maintaining an outward appearance of casual indifference. "I'll keep that in mind," he said quietly, closing the locker and turning to walk away. Chase's hand shot out to grab Adrian's shoulder, but the new student had already moved, flowing around the attempted contact with a fluid grace that made the gesture look accidental rather than evasive. "Where do you think you're going, comrade? I wasn't finished talking to you." "To chemistry class," Adrian replied without turning around, consulting his schedule as he walked toward the science wing. I don't want to be late on my first day." The dismissal stung Chase more than any direct insult could have, and he watched Adrian disappear into the crowd with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for opposing defenses. The new kid had just made a serious mistake, one that would require correction through increasingly painful lessons until proper respect was established. Chase pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his crew. "New target acquired. Russian kid named Volkov. Time for some international relations." Adrian's first period chemistry class provided a temporary refuge from the social dynamics of the hallways, though he couldn't help but notice the way conversations quieted when he entered the room and the careful distance other students maintained when choosing their seats. Mrs. Chen, the chemistry teacher, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had clearly seen enough teenage drama to recognize trouble brewing when she spotted it. She assigned Adrian to a lab station near the front of the room, paired him with a quiet girl named Jessica Liu, who seemed grateful for a partner who wouldn't spend the period flirting or goofing off. "Don't let them get to you," Jessica whispered during a brief moment when Mrs. Chen was writing equations on the board. "The quarterback crew thinks they own the school, but they're mostly just loud and stupid. If you keep your head down and don't give them a reason to focus on you, they'll usually move on to easier targets." Adrian glanced at her with mild surprise, noting the genuine concern in her voice and the way she kept her own gaze fixed on her notebook to avoid drawing attention to their conversation. "Thanks for the advice," he replied quietly. "I'm hoping to just get through the year without any drama." Jessica's slight smile suggested she found his optimism touching but misguided. "Good luck with that. Guys like Chase Morrison don't really do without drama. It's like asking a shark not to smell blood in the water." The remainder of the class passed without incident, but Adrian could feel eyes on him throughout the period, and he caught Chase's crew conducting what appeared to be a reconnaissance mission from their positions near the back of the room. They were studying him with the kind of focused attention that predators reserved for potential prey, making mental notes about his behavior, responses, and potential vulnerabilities. By the time the bell rang, Adrian understood that his hopes for a quiet senior year had been effectively demolished before lunch period. The hallway transition between first and second period provided Adrian's introduction to Lincoln High's peculiar ecosystem of territorial boundaries and unspoken rules. Certain areas near the trophy cases belonged exclusively to upperclassmen, while underclassmen learned to navigate alternate routes to avoid potential confrontations. The area around Brett Hammond's locker had developed into something resembling a royal court, where lesser students gathered to pay tribute in the form of homework assistance, party invitations, and general adoration. Adrian made the mistake of taking the most direct route to his second period English class, which required passing through what Tommy Rodriguez had claimed as his personal domain near the gymnasium entrance. Well, what do we have here?" Tommy's voice carried clearly over the hallway noise, causing nearby students to either scatter or position themselves to watch the upcoming entertainment. "Looks like the new kid didn't get the memo about traffic patterns around here." Adrian paused, recognizing that continuing to walk would be interpreted as disrespect, while stopping would signal weakness. He chose a middle ground, turning to face Tommy while maintaining a relaxed posture that suggested neither aggression nor submission. "Sorry, I'm still learning my way around. Is there a particular route I should be taking?" Tommy's dark eyes glittered with anticipation as he stepped closer, his compact frame radiating barely controlled violence. "Oh, there's definitely a route you should be taking, comrade. It's called the long way around, and it involves showing proper respect to people who've earned their place in the hierarchy here." "I meant no disrespect," Adrian replied calmly, his accent becoming slightly more pronounced under stress, in a way that made several onlookers smirk with amusement. "I was simply trying to get to class on time." "See, that's your problem right there," Tommy continued, playing to his growing audience with theatrical gestures. You think you can just walk in here on day one and act like you belong in the same spaces as people who've been building their reputations for years. That's not how things work at Lincoln High. The crowd of spectators had grown larger, forming a loose circle around the confrontation while maintaining enough distance to scatter quickly if teachers appeared. Adrian noticed Nathan Price hovering near the edge of the group with his phone out, no doubt recording the interaction for later distribution across social media platforms. The digital humiliation would extend far beyond the school grounds, making any perceived weakness a permanent part of his online identity. "What would you suggest?" Adrian asked, genuinely curious about Tommy's expectations, while simultaneously calculating angles and distances in case the situation escalated beyond verbal intimidation. Tommy's grin revealed teeth that were slightly too white and perfectly straight, suggesting expensive orthodontic work that contrasted sharply with his aggressive working-class persona. "I suggest you learn your place, new boy. Lincoln High has a natural order, and foreign kids who don't speak proper English belong somewhere near the bottom of that order. You want to walk through my territory, you pay the toll." "And what would that toll be?" Adrian's voice remained level, despite the growing tension in the hallway, and several observers began to murmur about his unexpected calm in the face of Tommy's obvious threat. Tommy reached out with one finger to poke Adrian in the chest, a gesture designed to humiliate through its casual disrespect while remaining technically non-violent enough to avoid serious disciplinary action. $20 a week, paid every Monday morning, plus whatever homework help I might need in subjects that are clearly too advanced for someone with your background. The finger never made contact. Adrian shifted slightly to his left, a movement so subtle that most observers missed it entirely, causing Tommy's gesture to fall short by mere inches. To casual observers, it appeared as though Tommy had simply miscalculated the distance, but the quarterback's eyes narrowed as he realized that the new kid had deliberately evaded his attempt at physical dominance. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Adrian said carefully, taking a small step backward to re-establish a comfortable distance while demonstrating that he wasn't looking for confrontation. "I'm not interested in paying anyone for the privilege of walking to class, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to help with homework that other students should be completing independently." The hallway had gone noticeably quiet, with even the background chatter of distant conversations seeming to fade as students sensed that the situation was approaching a critical juncture. Tommy's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as a direct challenge to his authority, while Nathan continued recording with the dedicated focus of someone who understood that he was potentially capturing viral content. "Not interested," Tommy repeated slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried clearly through the silent corridor. "Did this foreign freak just tell me he's not interested in following the rules that everyone else follows without question?" Before Adrian could respond, the sharp click of high heels on linoleum announced the approach of Vice Principal Martinez, whose reputation for zero tolerance toward public disturbances had earned her the nickname the Terminator among the student body. The crowd began to disperse with the practiced efficiency of teenagers who had learned to vanish at the first sign of administrative attention, leaving only Tommy, Adrian, and a few stragglers who were either too slow or too curious to escape in time. "Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Volkov," Mrs. Martinez's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 20 years of dealing with teenage nonsense. "I trust you're both heading to your next classes rather than conducting social gatherings in my hallways." Tommy's aggressive posture melted away instantly, replaced by the kind of innocent confusion that he had perfected during years of avoiding serious consequences for his actions. "Of course, Mrs. Martinez. I was just helping the new student find his way around the building. You know how confusing it can be for foreign kids to adapt to American schools." Adrian bit back his first response, recognizing the trap that Tommy was attempting to construct. Any defense of his English proficiency or American cultural knowledge would sound defensive and potentially confirm the stereotype that Tommy was trying to establish. Instead, he simply nodded politely to Mrs. Martinez and consulted his schedule with the kind of studious attention that suggested his primary concern was academic rather than social. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Rodriguez," Mrs. Martinez replied, in a tone that suggested she wasn't fooled by Tommy's performance, but was choosing not to pursue the matter further. "I'm sure Mr. Volkov appreciates your guidance. Now both of you need to get to class before you're marked tardy." The warning bell chimed through the hallway speakers, providing a convenient excuse for the confrontation to end without resolution. Tommy shot Adrian a look that promised future consequences before heading toward the math wing, while Adrian continued on his original path to English class with the uncomfortable awareness that he had just painted a target on his back that would only grow larger over time. His second period English class proved to be another temporary sanctuary, though Adrian noticed several students pulling out their phones during the teacher's opening lecture to check what appeared to be newly posted social media content. The occasional glances in his direction and muffled snickers suggested that Nathan's recording had already begun making the rounds through the school's digital networks, though the footage itself would likely be disappointingly tame for viewers hoping for dramatic physical confrontation. Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to Tommy despite the shared surname, was an earnest woman in her 30s who had clearly entered the teaching profession with genuine idealistic goals about shaping young minds and fostering intellectual growth. Her enthusiasm for literature and writing provided a sharp contrast to the social dynamics that dominated most of Lincoln High's atmosphere, and Adrian found himself genuinely engaged with the discussion of character development in contemporary fiction. Unfortunately, his participation in class discussion only served to highlight his articulate English and broad knowledge base, qualities that would mark him as even more of a threat to students who had built their identities around their perceived intellectual superiority. The transition to third period brought Adrian face to face with the heart of Lincoln High's social ecosystem: physical education class. The gymnasium was Coach Williams' undisputed kingdom, a realm where athletic prowess determined social standing and weakness was exposed under fluorescent lights that seemed designed to highlight every physical inadequacy. Coach Williams himself was a thick-set man in his 50s, whose glory days as a high school football star had never quite ended, leaving him to live vicariously through current student athletes while maintaining barely concealed contempt for anyone who couldn't contribute to his program's success. The locker room proved to be its own unique form of social battlefield, where designer athletic wear competed with generic brand alternatives, and where physical development was scrutinized with the kind of attention typically reserved for livestock auctions. Adrian changed quickly and quietly, noting the expensive gear that Brett Hammond's crew displayed like peacock feathers, while avoiding eye contact that might be interpreted as either challenge or submission. His own simple black shorts and grey t-shirt marked him as neither wealthy nor impoverished, a neutral ground that he hoped might allow him to remain relatively invisible. The day's activity was basketball, a sport that favored height and athleticism while punishing the kind of fluid movement patterns that Sistema had taught Adrian to value. Coach Williams divided the class into teams with the casual disregard for fairness that characterized most high school physical education, ensuring that Brett's crew dominated one squad while placing Adrian on a team consisting primarily of students who had clearly been chosen more for their expendability than their athletic potential. "All right, ladies," Coach Williams announced with the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested he was going through motions rather than pursuing genuine educational goals. "Let's see what kind of heart you've got out there. Remember, basketball is about more than just skill. It's about courage, determination, and the willingness to take contact when you drive to the basket. The game began with predictable results, as Brett's team established early dominance through a combination of superior athleticism and casual rule bending that the coach either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Adrian found himself matched up against Chase Morrison, who had clearly decided to use the basketball court as an opportunity to continue their earlier psychological warfare through legal physical contact and pointed commentary about Adrian's performance. "Come on, comrade," Chase taunted as he dribbled past Adrian for an easy layup. "I thought Russians were supposed to be tough. You're playing like you've never seen a basketball before." Adrian focused on positioning and team play rather than individual confrontation, using his understanding of angles and leverage to create opportunities for his teammates while avoiding the kind of flashy individual effort that might draw additional attention from Brett's crew. His restrained approach seemed to frustrate Chase, who had clearly hoped to provoke some kind of response that could be used as justification for escalation. The turning point came midway through the second quarter, when Tommy Rodriguez decided to test Adrian's pain tolerance through a series of increasingly aggressive fouls that Coach Williams either didn't see or chose not to call. What began as hard but legal contact gradually escalated to elbows during rebounds, knee-to-thigh contact during screens, and the kind of trash talk that was designed to provoke retaliation rather than merely intimidate. "What's wrong, foreign boy?" Tommy whispered during a break in play, his voice low enough to avoid detection by the coach, but clear enough for nearby players to hear. "You look like you're about to cry. Maybe basketball is too physical for someone from a country full of ballet dancers and figure skaters." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his focus on the game rather than allowing himself to be drawn into Tommy's provocation. Years of training with his father had taught him that emotional reactions in combat situations led to poor decisions and unnecessary injuries, lessons that applied equally well to high school social combat. The final escalation came with 3 minutes remaining in the period, when Brett Hammond decided to personally involve himself in what had previously been Tommy's individual campaign. During a routine rebound attempt, Brett's elbow accidentally caught Adrian in the ribs with enough force to double him over and send him stumbling toward the out-of-bounds line. The contact was technically legal within basketball's physical standards, but the follow-through and the satisfied smirk on Brett's face made his intentions clear to everyone on the court. "Sorry about that, new kid," Brett said loudly enough for Coach Williams to hear, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Guess you need to learn to box out better if you want to play with the big boys." Adrian straightened slowly, his breathing controlled and his expression neutral despite the sharp pain radiating through his torso. The hit had been expertly delivered to cause maximum discomfort without creating visible injury, suggesting that Brett had considerable experience with this type of calculated violence. Several of Adrian's teammates shot him sympathetic glances, but none offered verbal support that might draw Brett's attention to themselves. Coach Williams blew his whistle to end the period, having apparently missed the entire sequence of escalating aggression, despite being positioned only 15 feet away from the action. "Good intensity out there, gentlemen. Hit the showers and get ready for your next classes." The locker room provided no escape from the harassment, as Brett's crew had strategically positioned themselves to control the most direct path to the showers and exits. Adrian gathered his belongings methodically, hoping to avoid further confrontation while maintaining the kind of dignity that might discourage future targeting. Unfortunately, his quiet composure seemed to have the opposite effect, convincing his tormentors that he was either too weak or too scared to defend himself. "Hey, Volkov," Nathan Price called out from his position near the door, his pale face flushed with excitement at being included in the harassment campaign. "My dad wants to know if your family has all their immigration paperwork in order. You know how the police department likes to check up on foreign nationals who might be in the country illegally. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that Nathan's father's position as police chief could be used to make life extremely difficult for Adrian's family, regardless of their legal status. Adrian paused in his packing, recognizing that this escalation had moved beyond simple school bullying into territory that could affect his parents' jobs and his sister's safety. "We're legal residents," Adrian replied calmly, his accent becoming more pronounced as stress affected his speech patterns. "My father works at Morrison Manufacturing, and we have all the proper documentation." Brett's eyes lit up with interest at the mention of his father's company, suggesting new avenues for harassment that could extend beyond the school grounds. "Morrison Manufacturing, huh? My dad owns that company, which means he's basically your dad's boss. Maybe I should mention to him that one of his employees' kids has been causing trouble at school." The locker room had gone quiet, except for the sound of running water from the shower area, and Adrian realized that every word of this conversation was being absorbed by potential witnesses who would either remain silent or, more likely, spread the story throughout the school as entertainment. His response now would set the tone for how he would be treated for the remainder of his time at Lincoln High. "I haven't caused any trouble," Adrian said quietly, shouldering his backpack and moving toward the exit. "I'm just trying to attend my classes and complete my education." Chase stepped into his path, close enough to make the confrontation unmistakably intentional, while maintaining enough distance to claim innocence if questioned by authority figures. "See, that's where you're wrong, comrade. Your very presence here is causing trouble. You're disrupting the natural order of things, taking up space that belongs to students who actually deserve to be here." "Yeah," Tommy added from his position, flanking Adrian's left side, "and walking around like you're better than everyone else just because you can pronounce big words. That's disrespectful to students who've been building their reputations here for years." Adrian found himself surrounded by three larger, stronger opponents in a confined space with limited escape routes and no adult supervision. The tactical situation was poor, but Systema training had prepared him for exactly this type of disadvantageous scenario. His breathing remained controlled, his posture relaxed but ready, and his mind began calculating the most efficient methods for neutralizing multiple attackers if the situation escalated to physical violence. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Adrian replied honestly, his gray eyes moving between the three faces surrounding him. "I just want to get to my next class without any problems." Brett's hand moved to rest on Adrian's shoulder in a gesture that appeared friendly to casual observers, but applied just enough pressure to be uncomfortable and controlling. "That's exactly the attitude I'm talking about. You think you can just walk away from conversations with your betters without permission. That's not how things work around here." The shower area had gone silent, suggesting that other students were either listening intently or had fled to avoid becoming witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Adrian could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden quiet, a steady rhythm that his father had taught him to use as a metronome for combat breathing. Violence was becoming increasingly likely, but he still hoped to find a path that wouldn't require revealing his capabilities or crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "What is it you want from me?" Adrian asked directly, meeting Brett's gaze without flinching away from the intimidation tactics that had probably worked on countless previous targets. Brett's smile widened at what he perceived as submission, though Adrian was actually gathering information about his opponent's expectations and potential demands. "I want you to understand your place in the food chain here. You're new, you're foreign, and you're weak. That puts you somewhere near the bottom, which means you show respect to your betters and you pay for the privilege of sharing space with real Americans." "Pay how?" Adrian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on Tommy's earlier demands. $50 a week, Chase interjected, apparently having decided that Tommy's original price had been too modest. Plus, homework assistance in any subjects where your superior foreign education might actually be useful. Consider it a cultural exchange program. The demand was outrageous enough to be insulting, but Adrian recognized that the specific amount mattered less than the principle being established. Paying anything would mark him as a victim and ensure that the demands would escalate indefinitely, while refusing would guarantee immediate physical consequences. Either choice would establish patterns that would define his remaining time at Lincoln High. "I can't afford $50 a week," Adrian said truthfully, his family's financial struggles making such payments genuinely impossible, even if he had been willing to submit to extortion. Brett's grip on his shoulder tightened, fingernails digging through the fabric of Adrian's shirt to create discomfort without leaving visible marks. "Then I guess you'll have to find creative ways to make up the difference. Maybe you can convince your dad to work some overtime shifts at my father's company, or perhaps your mother can pick up extra cleaning jobs to fund your education in American social customs." The mention of his parents crossed a line that Adrian hadn't even realized existed until it was violated. His jaw tightened fractionally, and for a brief moment, something cold and dangerous flickered behind his gray eyes. Tommy noticed the change immediately, his Street Fighter instincts recognizing the shift from passive victim to potential threat. "Oh, look at that," Tommy said with genuine excitement. "I think we just found a nerve. The little Russian bear doesn't like it when we talk about Mommy and Daddy, does he?" Nathan pulled out his phone again, clearly hoping to capture Adrian's emotional breakdown for later distribution. "This is going to be perfect content. Foreign kid loses his mind when confronted with American justice." Adrian's breathing deepened slightly, a change so subtle that only someone trained in combat arts would recognize it as preparation for violence. His father's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that Sistema was designed for situations exactly like this one, where multiple opponents used psychological warfare to break down their victims' resistance before moving to physical dominance. The techniques were there, waiting to be employed, but once he crossed that threshold, there would be no returning to the quiet anonymity he had hoped to maintain. "Leave my family out of this," Adrian said quietly, his voice carrying a quality that made all three of his tormentors pause momentarily. Brett recovered first, interpreting Adrian's response as desperation rather than warning. "Or what? You'll go crying to the teachers? File a complaint with the administration? Your family are immigrants working minimum wage jobs, which means you have no power here. No connections, no influence, no protection." "My dad's the police chief," Nathan added helpfully, "which means any complaints you make will come directly to him before they go anywhere else. And he's very interested in making sure that foreign troublemakers don't disrupt our community's peace and stability." The locker room door opened suddenly, admitting a group of underclassmen who took one look at the tense situation and immediately reversed course, their footsteps echoing as they fled, rather than risk becoming involved in upperclassmen drama. Their brief appearance served as a reminder that this confrontation was taking place in a semi-public space where discovery remained possible, though the chances of adult intervention seemed minimal. Chase glanced toward the door before refocusing on Adrian with renewed intensity. "Clock's ticking, comrade. Make your choice. Pay what you owe for the privilege of attending our school, or learn the hard way that there are consequences for disrespecting your betters." Adrian's mind raced through options and possibilities, calculating the likelihood of various outcomes based on his potential responses. Submission would guarantee ongoing harassment and escalating demands, but might allow him to avoid immediate physical confrontation. Resistance would certainly lead to violence, but might establish boundaries that would discourage future targeting. Either choice carried risks that extended beyond his personal safety to potentially affect his family's precarious position in their new community. The decision was made for him when Brett's friendly hand on his shoulder suddenly shifted, fingers finding pressure points that sent sharp pain down Adrian's arm while maintaining the appearance of casual contact. The technique was sophisticated enough to suggest that Brett had some training in pain compliance methods, though not sophisticated enough to work effectively against someone who understood how to counter such approaches. Adrian's response was automatic, a flowing movement that redirected Brett's grip while simultaneously stepping away from the enclosure formed by his three opponents. To casual observers, it might have appeared as though Brett had simply lost his hold, but the controlled nature of Adrian's movement and the brief flash of surprise on Brett's face suggested that something more deliberate had occurred. "Interesting," Brett said slowly, flexing his fingers as if testing for injury. "Looks like our Russian friend has some tricks after all. That makes things more fun, doesn't it, boys?" The atmosphere in the locker room shifted perceptibly, moving from intimidation toward genuine confrontation as Brett's crew recognized that their target might not be as helpless as they had assumed. Tommy's stance became more overtly aggressive, while Chase began moving to flank Adrian's position in a way that suggested considerable experience with group tactics. "Last chance, foreign boy," Tommy said, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. "Pay up, shut up, and learn your place, or we teach you about American hospitality the hard way." Adrian's breathing had shifted into the rhythm his father had taught him for combat situations, deep, controlled breaths that maximized oxygen flow while maintaining calm mental state necessary for effective defensive action. His posture appeared relaxed to untrained observers, but every muscle was coiled and ready for explosive movement if the situation demanded it. "I told you," Adrian said quietly, his accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "I can't afford to pay you anything, and I won't help with homework that you should be doing yourselves." Brett's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Wrong answer." The attack came from three directions simultaneously, suggesting that Brett's crew had considerable experience with group confrontations and understood the importance of overwhelming their targets before organized resistance could develop. Tommy lunged forward with a straight punch aimed at Adrian's solar plexus, while Chase moved to grab his arms from behind and Brett prepared to deliver what would probably be a devastating knee strike to his immobilized midsection. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed throughout Lincoln High for months to come, though most witnesses would struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. Adrian seemed to melt away from Tommy's punch like water flowing around a stone, his movement so fluid that the aggressive sophomore's fist encountered nothing but empty air. The redirection of momentum sent Tommy stumbling forward into the space where Adrian had been standing, completely off balance and vulnerable to the knee strike that Adrian delivered to his thigh with surgical precision. Tommy's leg went numb instantly, systema techniques designed to disrupt nerve function rather than cause permanent damage. He collapsed sideways into Chase, who was attempting to circle behind Adrian, and found himself suddenly supporting his teammate's weight while trying to maintain his own balance. Brett's knee strike missed completely, as Adrian flowed away from the attack with movements that seemed to violate the normal laws of physics governing teenage combat. Instead of running or creating distance, Adrian moved closer to Brett, his hands finding pressure points along the larger boy's arm that caused involuntary muscle spasms and temporarily disrupted his coordination. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, leaving Brett's crew scattered around the locker room in various states of confusion and discomfort, while Adrian stood in the center of the space, breathing normally and appearing completely unruffled by the encounter. Nathan's phone had captured some of the action, though the speed and fluidity of Adrian's movements made them difficult to analyze in real time. "What the hell was that?" Brett demanded, shaking his arm to restore feeling while staring at Adrian with a mixture of shock and fury. Adrian straightened his shirt and shouldered his backpack, moving toward the exit with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the confrontation. "That was me declining your offer," he said quietly. "I hope we can avoid future misunderstandings." Tommy was struggling to stand, his legs still largely unresponsive to normal neural commands, while Chase helped support his weight while shooting murderous glances at Adrian's retreating form. "This isn't over, you freak," Chase called out, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present earlier. Adrian paused at the doorway, turning back to meet their collective gaze with steady grey eyes that held depths none of them had noticed before. "I hope it is," he said sincerely. "I really do." The locker room door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Brett's crew to contemplate what had just happened and plan their response to this unexpected development. Nathan immediately began reviewing the footage on his phone, though the poor lighting and rapid movement made it difficult to determine exactly how Adrian had neutralized their attack so efficiently. "Did you see how he moved?" Tommy asked, as feeling gradually returned to his leg. "That wasn't normal teenage fighting, that was something else entirely." Brett flexed his arm experimentally, noting that the strange numbness was beginning to fade, but unwilling to admit how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered by someone who appeared to have no significant physical advantages. "Doesn't matter what kind of tricks he knows. We outnumber him and we control this school. He just made things personal." Chase nodded grimly while helping Tommy to a nearby bench. "We need to be smarter about this. The freak has some kind of training, which means we can't just rush him like we do with normal targets. But everyone has weaknesses, and we're going to find his." Nathan was already scrolling through his contacts, his pale face flushed with excitement despite the humiliating outcome of their attempted intimidation. "My dad's going to want to see this footage. If this Russian kid has been trained in some kind of foreign fighting system, that might constitute a threat to school safety that requires police investigation." Brett's smile returned as he contemplated new avenues for harassment that would extend far beyond the school grounds. "Perfect. Let's see how tough the little commie feels when he's dealing with actual law enforcement instead of just teenagers." Meanwhile, we spread the word that he attacked 3 students without provocation. By lunchtime, everyone in school will know that Adrian Volkov is a dangerous foreign element who can't be trusted around normal American kids. The strategy was sound from their perspective, leveraging both official authority and social pressure to isolate Adrian before he could establish any meaningful connections within the student body. What they failed to consider was that Adrian's display of unexpected capability might inspire curiosity rather than fear among certain segments of the school population, particularly students who had experienced their own difficulties with Brett's reign of terror. Adrian's 4th period calculus class provided another temporary sanctuary, though he could feel the weight of curious glances from classmates who had apparently received text messages or social media updates about the locker room incident. His mathematics teacher, Mr. Peterson, was a genuinely dedicated educator who maintained strict classroom discipline and showed no tolerance for the kind of social drama that infected other areas of the school environment. The material was challenging but familiar, as Adrian's previous school had maintained higher academic standards that left him well prepared for Lincoln High's curriculum. His comfort with advanced mathematical concepts drew approving nods from Mr. Peterson and suspicious glances from classmates who were struggling with concepts that Adrian found relatively straightforward. Once again, his academic competence served to mark him as different in ways that would probably create additional social complications. "Mr. Volkov," Mr. Peterson said during a brief pause in his lecture, "would you mind working through problem 15 on the board? I think your approach might help clarify the concept for your classmates." Adrian moved to the front of the classroom with quiet confidence, taking the offered marker and beginning to work through the complex equation with the kind of systematic precision that his father had taught him to apply to all challenging problems. His explanation was clear and methodical, breaking down each step in ways that made the solution accessible to students who had been struggling with similar problems. Several classmates appeared genuinely grateful for the clarification, though Adrian noticed others exchanging glances that suggested his mathematical competence was being filed away as another mark against him in Lincoln High's complex social calculations. Intelligence, like physical capability, could be seen as either an asset or a threat, depending on how it was wielded and perceived by the existing power structure. The lunch period would provide the first real test of how the morning's events had affected Adrian's social standing within the broader student body. The cafeteria was Lincoln High's most complex social ecosystem, where seating arrangements reflected and reinforced the school's hierarchical structures through a series of unspoken but rigidly enforced territorial boundaries. Adrian purchased a simple lunch of pizza and milk, noting the way conversations quieted as he moved through the serving line and how other students seemed to be observing his actions with unusual interest. Word of the locker room incident had clearly spread throughout the school's gossip networks, though the details had probably been distorted through multiple retellings to emphasize different aspects of the story. The central area of the cafeteria belonged exclusively to Brett Hammond's crew and their associated social satellites, a prime real estate location that commanded views of the entire room while providing easy access to both the serving line and the exit doors. Brett sat at the head of a long table surrounded by football players, cheerleaders, and other students who had earned the privilege of basking in reflected popularity through their usefulness to the established social order. Adrian chose a small table near the windows, far enough from the central power structure to avoid being seen as provocative, but not so isolated as to appear completely antisocial. He ate methodically while observing the complex interactions taking place throughout the room, noting alliance patterns and social dynamics that would help him navigate future encounters with greater awareness of potential consequences. His peaceful meal was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica Liu, the quiet girl from his chemistry class who had offered advice about avoiding Brett's crew during their first meeting. She approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain whether associating with Adrian was wise, given the morning's developments, but apparently compelled by some combination of curiosity and genuine concern. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from Adrian's position. "Please," Adrian replied, grateful for the company and the implicit statement that at least one student wasn't afraid to be seen with him, despite whatever rumors might be circulating. Jessica settled into her seat with the careful precision of someone who had learned to avoid drawing unwanted attention through excessive movement or noise. "So," she said quietly, "I heard there was some excitement in the boys' locker room this morning." Adrian glanced toward Brett's table, noting that several members of his crew were clearly watching his interaction with Jessica while conducting their own animated discussion. "Some misunderstanding about school policies," he replied diplomatically. "Misunderstandings that leave Tommy Rodriguez limping and Brett Hammond looking like someone deflated his ego?" Jessica's slight smile suggested that she found these developments more amusing than concerning. Adrian paused in his eating, surprised by both Jessica's knowledge of specific details and her apparent approval of the morning's outcome. "News travels fast around here." "Faster than you might think," Jessica confirmed. "Half the school saw Tommy hobbling to his next class, and Nathan Price has been showing that video to anyone who'll watch it. The problem is that most people can't tell exactly what happened because everything moved so fast." That was both good and bad news from Adrian's perspective. The ambiguity might prevent people from understanding the full extent of his capabilities, but it also left room for Brett's crew to craft whatever narrative would be most damaging to his reputation and social standing. "What are people saying?" Adrian asked, genuinely curious about how the incident was being interpreted by the broader student body. Jessica glanced around the cafeteria before leaning slightly forward to lower her voice. "Opinions are divided. Brett's friends are claiming you attacked them without provocation, possibly using some kind of foreign fighting techniques that give you an unfair advantage in normal teenage confrontations. But some people think it's about time someone stood up to their bullying, especially after what happened to Marcus Chen last month." Adrian raised an eyebrow questioningly, unfamiliar with the reference Jessica had made. "Marcus was a junior who made the mistake of accidentally bumping into Chase Morrison in the hallway," Jessica explained. "They made his life so miserable that his parents finally transferred him to a private school across town. He was a good kid who just wanted to study and stay out of trouble, but that wasn't enough to protect him once he got on their radar." The story was uncomfortably familiar, following patterns that Adrian recognized from his observations of social dynamics in his previous schools. Bullies required victims to maintain their status within group hierarchies, and students who appeared vulnerable became targets regardless of their intentions or behavior. "What about the teachers and administration?" Adrian asked. "Don't they intervene in situations like that?" Jessica's expression suggested that his question revealed significant naivety about Lincoln High's operational realities. Officially, the school has zero tolerance for bullying and harassment. Unofficially, Brett's father donates enough money to the athletic programs that complaints about his son tend to get lost in bureaucratic shuffles. Plus, Nathan's dad being police chief means that any serious accusations would go through him before reaching outside authorities. The systemic nature of the problem was becoming clear, with multiple layers of protection insulating Brett's crew from meaningful consequences for their actions. Adrian's situation was complicated by his family's vulnerable position as recent immigrants whose legal status and employment depended on maintaining good relationships within the community. "So what happens now?" Adrian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now they escalate," Jessica replied grimly. "You embarrassed them in front of witnesses, which means they can't just let it go without losing face. They'll probably try to isolate you socially first, making sure that associating with you becomes dangerous for other students. Then they'll look for opportunities to hurt you in ways that can't be traced back to them directly." As if summoned by their conversation, Nathan Price appeared at their table with his phone in hand and a nervous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said with forced cheerfulness. "I was hoping I could ask you both a few questions for the school newspaper." Adrian and Jessica exchanged glances, both recognizing Nathan's offer as something other than legitimate journalism. "What kind of questions?" Adrian asked carefully. Nathan activated his phone's recording function with exaggerated transparency, placing the device on the table between them. "Just some basic information about your background and your adjustment to American schools. You know, human interest stuff about the challenges facing immigrant students." The questions that followed were carefully crafted to elicit responses that could be edited and presented out of context to support whatever narrative Brett's crew wanted to construct. Nathan asked about Adrian's family's reasons for coming to America, their previous living situation, his father's military background, and his own experience with foreign fighting techniques that might not be appropriate for American school environments. Adrian answered truthfully but minimally, recognizing the trap while being unable to avoid it entirely without appearing uncooperative or suspicious. Jessica remained silent but alert, clearly understanding the interview's true purpose while being powerless to prevent it. "One final question," Nathan said, with the satisfied expression of someone who had saved his most important inquiry for last. Some students are concerned that your reaction to normal teenage social interaction this morning might indicate a propensity toward violence that could threaten school safety. Would you like to address those concerns? The question was expertly crafted to create problems, regardless of how Adrian responded. Denying violent tendencies might be interpreted as dishonesty given the morning's events, while acknowledging his training could be presented as confirmation that he posed a threat to other students. "I believe in defending myself when attacked," Adrian replied carefully, "but I prefer to resolve conflicts through communication rather than violence whenever possible." Nathan's smile widened as he ended the recording, clearly satisfied with responses that could be edited to support multiple interpretations. "Thanks for your time. This should make a really interesting article about cultural differences in conflict resolution." After Nathan departed to rejoin Brett's table, Jessica shook her head with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You handled that better than most people would have, but it doesn't really matter what you said. They'll edit it to make you sound like either a dangerous foreign agent or a pathetic victim, depending on which narrative serves their purposes better." Adrian finished his lunch while contemplating the escalating complexity of his situation. What had begun as simple bullying was evolving into something more sophisticated and potentially dangerous, involving elements of xenophobia, class conflict, and abuse of institutional authority that extended far beyond typical teenage social drama. The afternoon classes proceeded without major incident, though Adrian noticed increased attention from both students and teachers as word of the morning's events continued to spread throughout the school community. His chemistry lab partner Jessica proved to be both an excellent study companion and a valuable source of information about Lincoln High's hidden social dynamics, while his other teachers maintained professional neutrality, despite clearly being aware of his growing notoriety. The final bell of the day brought both relief and apprehension as Adrian prepared to navigate the after-school period when adult supervision decreased significantly and opportunities for unsupervised confrontation increased accordingly. The parking lot and surrounding areas became Brett's crew's prime hunting grounds, where they could operate with relative impunity while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. Adrian's route home required walking past the student parking area where Brett's expensive sports car served as an informal gathering point for his social circle and their admirers. The group was clearly waiting for him, positioned to make avoidance impossible without taking a significantly longer route that would appear cowardly to observers. Brett Hammond stood beside his gleaming red Mustang like a king holding court, surrounded by his crew and several additional students who had apparently been recruited for this particular confrontation. The group was larger than the morning's encounter, suggesting that word of Adrian's unexpected capabilities had prompted them to call in reinforcements for round 2. "Well, well," Brett called out loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "If it isn't our Russian exchange student, I hear you've been telling people that you were attacked without provocation this morning." Adrian paused at what he judged to be a safe distance, his backpack positioned for quick removal if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. "I haven't been telling anyone anything," he replied truthfully. "I'm just trying to get home." "See, that's the problem," Chase Morrison interjected, stepping forward with the confident swagger of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "You keep trying to avoid taking responsibility for your actions. That shows a lack of character that's typical of people from countries without strong moral traditions." The crowd of observers was growing larger as students delayed their departures to watch whatever entertainment Brett's crew had planned. Several appeared to be recording with their phones, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved and distributed throughout the school's digital networks within minutes. Tommy Rodriguez was present despite his earlier injury, though Adrian noticed that he favored his left leg and seemed less eager to position himself at the front of the group. The Systema techniques had been designed to cause temporary discomfort rather than permanent damage, but the psychological impact of being neutralized so easily appeared to have lasting effects on Tommy's confidence. "My father spoke with the police chief this afternoon," Brett continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from knowing his family's influence extended throughout the community's power structures. "Chief Price is very concerned about reports of foreign nationals using military combat techniques against American students on school property." Nathan stepped forward with his phone prominently displayed, apparently conducting an official interview rather than the informal recording session from lunch. "Mr. Volkov, would you care to comment on allegations that you employed foreign military training to assault 3 students during what they describe as a friendly attempt to welcome you to Lincoln High?" The questions were being asked in front of a growing audience that included students, parents picking up their children, and at least one teacher who had emerged from the building to investigate the commotion. Adrian realized that his response would become part of an official record that could be used to support whatever legal or disciplinary action Brett's family might decide to pursue. "I defended myself when I was surrounded and attacked," Adrian replied clearly, his accent making his words even more distinct for the recording devices. "I used minimal force necessary to prevent injury to myself." Brett's laugh was sharp and theatrical, designed to play to the crowd rather than express genuine amusement. "Minimal force? Tommy can barely walk, and I still don't have full feeling in my arm. If that's your idea of minimal force, what would maximum force look like?" The question was designed to elicit either a threat that could be used as evidence of violent intentions or a denial that would contradict the obvious effectiveness of Adrian's defensive actions. Either response would create problems for his position, while remaining silent might be interpreted as admission of guilt. "Maximum force would have resulted in permanent injuries," Adrian said quietly, his grey eyes meeting Brett's with steady intensity. "I chose not to cause permanent injuries." The admission sent a ripple of reaction through the gathered crowd, as students processed the implication that Adrian had been holding back during the morning's confrontation rather than using his full capabilities. Several observers stepped back involuntarily, apparently reconsidering their assessment of the quiet foreign student's potential danger level. Chase Morrison moved to flank Adrian's position, while Brett continued to dominate his attention from the front, a tactical maneuver that suggested they had learned from the morning's mistakes and were now approaching him with greater respect for his defensive capabilities. "You see," Brett announced to the crowd, "he just admitted that he deliberately chose to hurt American students rather than finding peaceful ways to resolve a simple misunderstanding. That's exactly the kind of foreign mindset that threatens our community's safety and values." The crowd was clearly divided in their reaction to Brett's interpretation, with some students nodding in agreement, while others appeared skeptical of his characterization of the morning's events. Adrian noticed several faces that seemed more curious than hostile, including a girl with short auburn hair who was watching him with the kind of intense attention that suggested professional interest rather than casual observation. "What martial art do you study?" the auburn-haired girl called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of crowd discussion with surprising authority. Adrian glanced toward her, noting the confident posture and direct gaze that suggested someone comfortable with confrontation, despite her relatively small stature. "Why do you ask?" "Because I study Krav Maga," she replied, stepping forward with movements that confirmed Adrian's assessment of her as someone with significant training. "And what I saw in Nathan's video looked like something I've never encountered before." Brett's expression darkened at this unexpected development, clearly recognizing that the conversation was moving in directions that didn't support his preferred narrative. "This isn't a martial arts demonstration, Rebecca. We're trying to address a serious safety concern involving foreign military techniques being used against American students. Rebecca Chen, no relation to the chemistry teacher despite sharing a surname, fixed Brett with a look that suggested years of experience dealing with his particular brand of arrogance. What I'm trying to address is the fact that you and your crew attacked someone who was clearly trying to avoid confrontation, and you're now trying to twist his successful defense into evidence of aggression. The dynamic was shifting as Rebecca's intervention provided legitimacy for students who had been skeptical of Brett's version of events, but reluctant to challenge him directly. Her reputation as one of Lincoln High's most formidable martial artists gave her words weight that might not have been accorded to other potential defenders. "Mind your own business, Rebecca," Tommy snarled, his earlier embarrassment making him more aggressive than wise. "This doesn't concern you." Rebecca's slight smile suggested that Tommy had just made a serious tactical error. "Actually, it concerns me quite a bit. You see, I've been documenting your crew's harassment campaigns for the past 2 years, and I'm always interested in meeting people who can defend themselves against your particular brand of group intimidation." Nathan immediately raised his phone to record Rebecca's comments, apparently recognizing that her words constituted a direct challenge to his crew's reputation and authority. "Are you threatening us, Rebecca?" "Because my father takes threats against students very seriously." "I'm offering information," Rebecca replied calmly, "to anyone who might be interested in learning about patterns of harassment that certain school officials seem reluctant to address through normal channels." The tension in the parking lot was becoming palpable as more students gathered to witness what was clearly escalating beyond normal teenage social drama into territory that might have serious consequences for all involved parties. Adrian found himself at the center of a confrontation that had grown beyond his ability to control or escape through his preferred method of strategic withdrawal. Brett's crew was clearly committed to some form of escalation that would restore their damaged reputation and establish dominance over both Adrian and Rebecca, who had emerged as an unexpected ally in his defense. The presence of recording devices and adult witnesses would normally discourage physical confrontation, but the afternoon's events had apparently pushed the situation beyond normal social boundaries. "This is your last chance, foreign boy," Brett announced with theatrical finality, "to apologize for attacking American students and promise to show proper respect to your betters for the remainder of your time at Lincoln High." Adrian's breathing shifted almost imperceptibly into the combat rhythm his father had taught him, recognizing that peaceful resolution was no longer possible given the public nature of the confrontation and the investment that both sides now had in achieving victory. Rebecca Chen's presence had changed the tactical situation by providing a potential ally, but it had also raised the stakes by making backing down appear cowardly to the assembled audience. "I have nothing to apologize for," Adrian replied clearly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the recording devices without appearing to be playing to the crowd. "I defended myself when attacked, and I'll continue to defend myself if attacked again." Brett nodded to his crew with the satisfied expression of someone whose opponent had just provided justification for whatever consequences he had been planning. "You heard him, everyone. The foreign kid just threatened to attack American students again. I think we need to show him what happens to people who threaten violence in our school." The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, but with better coordination than the morning's locker room assault. Chase moved to grab Adrian's backpack from behind while Brett approached from the front with what appeared to be a weighted fist, and Tommy circled to cut off escape routes despite his lingering mobility issues. The plan was sound tactically, designed to overwhelm Adrian before he could employ whatever techniques had proved so effective earlier. What they hadn't anticipated was Rebecca Chen's immediate involvement in the confrontation, her Krav Maga training providing her with both the skills and the willingness to engage multiple opponents simultaneously. As Chase lunged for Adrian's backpack, Rebecca intercepted him with a perfectly executed knee strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over and sent him stumbling backward into the crowd of observers. Adrian's response to Brett's attack was another display of Sistema's fluid efficiency, as he seemed to melt away from the punch while simultaneously redirecting Brett's momentum with subtle hand movements that sent the larger boy stumbling past his intended target. The weighted knuckles that Brett had concealed beneath his fingers became visible as his hand opened involuntarily, drawing gasps from observers who realized that this had escalated beyond simple fistfighting into potentially deadly territory. Tommy's approach was cut short by a sweep that took his injured leg out from under him, sending him crashing to the asphalt with enough force to scrape skin from his palms and probably create bruises that would last for weeks. The technique was precisely applied to exploit his existing weakness while avoiding permanent damage, demonstrating both Adrian's tactical awareness and his continued restraint despite the escalating violence. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, leaving Brett's crew scattered around the parking lot while Adrian and Rebecca stood back-to-back in defensive positions, ready for whatever response the remaining opponents might mount. The crowd of observers had grown significantly larger, with several adults now present and multiple recording devices capturing every moment of the confrontation. Nathan Price was furiously typing on his phone, apparently sending updates to his father about the situation while simultaneously trying to maintain his recording responsibilities. "You saw it," he called out to the crowd. "They attacked us without provocation. Multiple foreign students using military combat techniques against American citizens on school property." Rebecca's laugh was sharp with contempt. "Your own video shows Brett attacking first with what appears to be brass knuckles or some other weapon. If your father is half the police officer you claim, he'll arrest Brett for assault with a deadly weapon rather than trying to blame the victims." The crowd murmured with agreement as several students pointed out details in the various recordings that supported Rebecca's interpretation of events. Brett struggled to his feet with his face flushed red from embarrassment and rage, the brass knuckles still visible in his hand despite his attempts to conceal them. "This isn't over," Brett snarled, his voice carrying more desperation than authority as he realized that the public nature of his defeat had probably cost him more than the physical confrontation itself. Adrian straightened his shirt and shouldered his backpack, noting that several adults were now approaching the scene with the determined stride of people who intended to take control of the situation. "I hope it is," he replied sincerely, meeting Brett's glare with steady composure. "I really do hope it's over." Principal Matthews arrived with the breathless urgency of someone who had been alerted to a major disturbance involving potential weapons and multiple injuries. His assessment of the scene took in the scattered positions of Brett's crew, the visible weapon in Brett's hand, and the calm demeanor of Adrian and Rebecca as they waited for adult intervention. "Mr. Hammond, drop whatever you're holding immediately," Principal Matthews commanded with the kind of authority that suggested he was taking the situation very seriously. "Everyone else, step back and prepare to give statements about what occurred here." Brett's attempt to pocket the brass knuckles was intercepted by Coach Williams, who had followed the principal from the building and possessed enough experience with teenage violence to recognize potential evidence when he saw it. "I'll take that," the coach said firmly, extending his hand with the expectation of immediate compliance. The aftermath of the parking lot confrontation would consume the rest of the afternoon and extend well into the evening as police officers, school administrators, and parents attempted to sort through conflicting accounts of what had transpired. Nathan's phone contained clear evidence of Brett initiating physical contact while armed with a weapon, though he tried unsuccessfully to argue that the footage had been edited or taken out of context. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Adrian and Rebecca had acted defensively throughout the encounter, using force only to neutralize attacks that had been initiated by Brett's crew. The brass knuckles constituted a significant escalation that transformed the incident from simple assault into felony charges that would require involvement from the district attorney's office. Adrian's parents arrived at the school within an hour of being contacted, his father's military bearing immediately apparent as he assessed the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested considerable experience with crisis management. Dmitry Volkov listened to his son's account of events with professional detachment before requesting to speak privately with Principal Matthews about the school's policies regarding student safety and harassment prevention. Elena Volkov focused her attention on Adrian himself, checking for injuries while simultaneously gathering information about the events that had led to such a dramatic confrontation. Her questions were pointed and practical, designed to determine whether their family's position in the community had been compromised by the day's events and what steps might be necessary to protect their interests. "Are you hurt?" she asked first, conducting the kind of visual assessment that suggested some familiarity with combat injuries. "No," Adrian replied honestly. "I was able to defend myself without being injured." "And the other students?" "Bruised, but not seriously injured," Adrian confirmed. "I used minimal force to neutralize the threats without causing permanent damage." Elena nodded approvingly, her expression suggesting that she understood both the tactical and political implications of Adrian's restraint during the confrontations. "Your father will be proud that you remembered his teachings about appropriate force levels." The meeting with Principal Matthews proved to be more complex than a simple disciplinary discussion, as the involvement of weapons and multiple family connections to local authority figures created jurisdictional questions that required careful navigation. Dmitry Volkov's military background and current employment with Morrison Manufacturing added additional layers of complication, as both factors could be seen as either assets or liabilities, depending on how the situation developed. Principal Matthews was clearly struggling to balance his responsibility to maintain school discipline with his awareness that the Volkovs possessed both legal standing and potential influence within the community, despite their recent arrival. Brett Hammond's family connections provided him with significant protection, but the presence of physical evidence in the form of weapons and video recordings limited the principal's ability to simply make the problem disappear through administrative discretion. "Mr. Volkov," Principal Matthews began carefully, "I want to assure you that Lincoln High takes all forms of violence very seriously, and we're committed to providing a safe learning environment for all students, regardless of their background or family circumstances." Dmitry's response was measured and professional, delivered in accented English that was nevertheless precise and authoritative. "I appreciate that commitment, Mr. Matthews. I'm sure you understand that my family's position as recent immigrants makes us particularly vulnerable to harassment that might be overlooked if it were directed toward more established community members." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that the Volkovs were prepared to escalate the matter through legal channels if they felt that the school's response was inadequate. Principal Matthews clearly recognized the delicate nature of the situation and the potential consequences of being seen as biased against immigrant families or tolerant of weapons-based violence. "What outcome would you consider appropriate?" Principal Matthews asked, apparently recognizing that the Volkovs held stronger legal and moral positions than he had initially assumed. Dmitry glanced toward Adrian before responding, his expression suggesting that he was carefully weighing multiple factors beyond simple school discipline. I want assurance that my son will be able to attend classes without being targeted for harassment or violence, and I want meaningful consequences for students who brought weapons onto school property with the apparent intent to cause injury. The request was reasonable but politically complicated, as it would require taking action against Brett Hammond despite his family's influence within the community. Principal Matthews was clearly reluctant to create problems with the Hammond family over what he might prefer to characterize as a mutual combat situation, but the presence of weapons and video evidence made such characterization legally untenable. We'll need to complete our investigation before making final determinations about disciplinary actions, Principal Matthews said diplomatically, but I can assure you that weapons violations are taken very seriously regardless of the student's background or family connections. Rebecca Chen's parents arrived shortly afterward, their professional demeanor suggesting careers that had prepared them for dealing with institutional bureaucracies and legal complications. Dr. Michael Chen worked as an emergency room physician while his wife Sarah served as a family law attorney, providing them with both medical expertise for assessing injuries and legal knowledge for protecting their daughter's interests. The Chen family's involvement added another layer of complexity to the situation, as Rebecca's intervention had been both legally justified and tactically effective, but had also expanded the scope of the confrontation beyond a simple dispute between Adrian and Brett's crew. Her martial arts training provided her with legitimate claims to self-defense, but her willingness to involve herself in conflicts involving other students raised questions about her judgment and potential liability. "Rebecca," Dr. Chen said after examining her for injuries, "can you explain why you chose to involve yourself in a confrontation that didn't directly concern you?" Rebecca's response was characteristically direct and unapologetic. "Because I've been watching Brett's crew terrorize students for 2 years, and I was tired of seeing people get hurt because adults won't take action to stop the harassment." Sarah Chen nodded approvingly at her daughter's explanation while making notes on a legal pad that suggested she was already considering potential civil actions that might arise from the day's events. "Did you feel that you were in immediate danger from Brett Hammond's group?" "Yes," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "When Adrian was surrounded by multiple attackers and Brett pulled out brass knuckles, I believed that serious injury was imminent unless someone intervened." The legal implications of Rebecca's statement were significant, as they established that multiple witnesses had perceived the situation as life-threatening enough to justify intervention through force. Her status as a trained martial artist gave her testimony additional weight, as courts typically accorded greater credibility to expert assessments of combat situations. Chief Price arrived at the school as the initial interviews were concluding, his official presence adding gravity to what might otherwise have been dismissed as routine teenage misbehavior. Nathan's father was clearly struggling to balance his parental instincts with his professional responsibilities, particularly given the clear evidence that his son's friends had initiated violence while armed with weapons. Adrian studied Chief Price carefully, noting the way his uniform and bearing commanded immediate respect from school officials, while simultaneously recognizing the difficult position that the day's events had created for him. Nathan's involvement in the harassment campaign was well documented through his own recordings, while Brett's use of weapons created legal obligations that couldn't be ignored regardless of family connections. "I'll need to speak with all the students involved," Chief Price announced formally, "as well as reviewing any physical evidence and witness statements. This appears to involve multiple potential felony charges that will require investigation by trained professionals rather than school administrators. The formal police investigation would consume several hours as officers interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and attempted to piece together an accurate timeline of events that had unfolded across multiple locations throughout the day." Adrian's calm cooperation and detailed recollection of events impressed the investigating officers, while Brett's crew's conflicting accounts and obvious attempts to minimize their culpability created credibility problems that would affect their legal positions. The final outcome of the investigation surprised many observers who had assumed that the Hammond family's influence would protect Brett from serious consequences. The combination of video evidence, witness testimony, and physical evidence in the form of weapons created a legal situation that couldn't be resolved through political influence or administrative discretion. Brett Hammond was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit assault, and bringing weapons onto school property, charges that carried potential felony penalties and would require resolution through the criminal court system rather than school discipline. His use of brass knuckles had escalated what might have been characterized as mutual combat into territory that prosecutors felt obligated to pursue regardless of political considerations. Chase Morrison and Tommy Rodriguez faced lesser charges related to their participation in coordinated attacks on other students, though their penalties would likely be reduced through plea negotiations given their secondary roles in the confrontations. Nathan Price's situation was more complex, as his father's position created obvious conflicts of interest that would require special prosecutors and careful handling to avoid appearances of favoritism. Adrian's legal position was essentially unassailable, as every piece of evidence supported his claims of acting defensively against unprovoked attacks by multiple opponents. His restraint in using minimal force necessary to neutralize threats actually worked in his favor, demonstrating that his training had included appropriate judgment about force levels rather than simply offensive capability. Rebecca Chen's intervention was similarly justified by the circumstances, though her willingness to engage in combat raised questions about whether she might have been able to de-escalate the situation through other means. Her parents' legal expertise ensured that she avoided any serious consequences, while positioning her as a potential witness against Brett's crew in future proceedings. The immediate aftermath of the investigation created significant changes in Lincoln High's social dynamics as students processed the reality that Brett Hammond's reign of terror had ended in criminal charges and likely expulsion. The removal of the school's primary source of harassment created opportunities for previously marginalized students to emerge from defensive positions, while forcing Brett's former followers to recalculate their allegiances and behavior patterns. Adrian's reputation underwent a dramatic transformation from vulnerable outsider to respected defender, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention and notoriety that accompanied his new status. Students who had previously ignored him now sought opportunities for interaction, while those who had participated in or encouraged harassment campaigns suddenly discovered pressing reasons to be elsewhere when he appeared. "You know," Rebecca said during their first lunch together following the investigation, "you could probably run for student council president and win by a landslide. Everyone's talking about how you stood up to Brett's crew and beat them without becoming like them." Adrian considered her suggestion while reviewing the chemistry homework that had somehow become less challenging since his social position had stabilized. "I'm not interested in popularity or power," he replied honestly. "I just wanted to attend school without being harassed." "Mission accomplished," Rebecca replied with satisfaction. "Plus, you managed to take down the most notorious bullies in school history without compromising your principles or becoming the kind of person you'd be ashamed to see in the mirror." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Jessica Liu, who had requested permission to join their informal lunch group following the dramatic resolution of Adrian's conflict with Brett's crew. Her perspective, as someone who had observed the entire sequence of events from beginning to end, provided valuable insights into how the changes were affecting the broader student body. "It's amazing how different the atmosphere is now," Jessica observed as she settled into her seat with obvious relief. People are actually speaking up in classes instead of staying quiet to avoid drawing attention. It's like the whole school is breathing easier. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that his individual conflict had apparently addressed systemic problems that had been affecting numerous students for extended periods. I didn't realize how much impact one group could have on the entire school environment. Groups like Brett's depend on everyone else being too scared to resist, Rebecca explained. Once someone demonstrates that they can be defeated, their power structure collapses because it was built on intimidation rather than legitimate authority. The remainder of Adrian's senior year proceeded with the kind of normalcy that he had originally hoped for when his family moved to Riverside. His academic performance remained excellent. His social connections expanded to include genuine friendships rather than strategic alliances. And his training sessions with his father took on new dimensions as they discussed the practical applications of system principles in real-world conflict resolution. Dmitry Volkov was quietly proud of his son's handling of the harassment campaign, particularly Adrian's demonstration of appropriate judgment about force levels and his refusal to allow violence to escalate beyond defensive necessity. "You remembered everything I taught you," he said during one of their evening training sessions. "But more importantly, you remembered why I taught it to you." Elena Volkov found herself more accepted within the community as word spread about her son's character and her family's commitment to American values of self-defense and personal responsibility. Her position at the hospital improved as colleagues recognized that the Volkovs represented the kind of immigrant family that strengthened rather than threatened their community's social fabric. Katya's experience at the middle school also improved dramatically as students learned that her older brother was the person who had defeated Lincoln High's notorious bullying ring through courage and skill rather than violence and intimidation. Her own confidence grew as she realized that being different wasn't necessarily a liability in American schools if you possessed the strength and determination to defend your position. Brett Hammond's criminal trial became a significant event in Riverside's legal calendar, attracting attention from regional media outlets that were interested in the story of immigrant students defending themselves against harassment from established community members. The evidence was overwhelming, and the outcomes were predictable, with Brett receiving probation and community service while facing permanent exclusion from Lincoln High and forfeiture of his college athletic scholarship. The Hammond family's response to their son's legal troubles revealed character traits that explained much about Brett's behavior and attitudes throughout his high school career. Rather than accepting responsibility for their son's actions, they attempted to blame the school system, law enforcement, and ultimately the Volkov family for creating the situation that had led to Brett's downfall. Richard Hammond's business relationship suffered as the community learned more about his son's behavior and his family's response to the criminal charges. Morrison Manufacturing's contract with Hammond Motors was quietly allowed to expire without renewal, while several other local businesses found reasons to seek alternative suppliers for their automotive needs. Nathan Price's situation proved to be the most complex of the group, as his father's position as police chief created conflicts of interest that required resolution through external authorities. Chief Price ultimately chose early retirement rather than face internal affairs investigations that might have revealed the extent to which his family connections had influenced his law enforcement decisions. The special prosecutor appointed to handle Nathan's case was less inclined toward leniency than local authorities might have been, resulting in charges that reflected the seriousness of participating in harassment campaigns that had driven students from school and created hostile educational environments for vulnerable populations. Chase Morrison's college scholarship was revoked following his criminal conviction, though his family's financial resources ensured that his educational opportunities weren't completely eliminated. His reputation as a tactical planner who had orchestrated systematic harassment campaigns would follow him to whatever institution he ultimately attended, creating social complications that would probably affect his college experience significantly. Tommy Rodriguez's situation was complicated by his adoption and his aggressive overcompensation for his ethnic appearance through participation in harassment directed toward other minority students. The criminal charges forced him to confront the contradictions in his identity and behavior, ultimately leading to counseling that helped him develop healthier ways to address his insecurities. Adrian's graduation from Lincoln High was attended by his entire extended family, including relatives who had traveled from Chicago to witness his achievement, despite the challenges he had faced throughout his senior year. His valedictory speech focused on themes of courage, integrity, and the responsibility that comes with possessing the ability to defend others against injustice. "Violence should always be a last resort," Adrian told the assembled students, families, and faculty members. "But when someone threatens you or people you care about, you have an obligation to stand up and protect what's right. That doesn't mean becoming the kind of person who uses strength to intimidate others, but it does mean being willing to use whatever abilities you have to defend justice and human dignity." Principal Matthews, who had initially struggled to handle the complex situation created by Adrian's conflicts with Brett's crew, eventually developed genuine respect for the young man's character and judgment. "Mr. Volkov represents the best of what we hope to see in our students," he said during the graduation ceremony. "Someone who combines academic excellence with moral courage and the wisdom to use his capabilities responsibly." Rebecca Chen's friendship with Adrian continued beyond high school as they both enrolled in colleges that would allow them to pursue careers in fields where their skills and principles could be used to help others. Rebecca planned to study law enforcement and criminal justice, while Adrian chose education with the goal of becoming a teacher who could help vulnerable students develop the confidence and skills necessary to defend themselves against harassment. "You changed everything," Rebecca told him during their final conversation before leaving for college. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was tired of being afraid. That's the kind of impact that most people never have the opportunity to make." Adrian's legacy at Lincoln High extended far beyond his individual achievement in defeating the school's most notorious bullying ring. The administrative policies that had allowed systematic harassment to flourish were revised to include mandatory reporting requirements and external oversight that would prevent future situations from developing to the same extent. The student body's culture shifted toward greater acceptance of diversity and more active intervention when harassment occurred, as Adrian's example had demonstrated that standing up to bullies was both possible and necessary for maintaining a healthy school environment. Students who had previously felt powerless discovered that collective action and moral courage could overcome even well-established patterns of intimidation and abuse. Years later, when Lincoln High students discussed the legendary confrontation that had ended Brett Hammond's reign of terror, they would emphasize not the violence that had occurred, but the restraint and wisdom that Adrian had demonstrated throughout the crisis. His refusal to become the kind of person he opposed, even when provoked beyond reasonable limits, provided a model for how strength could be used to protect rather than dominate. The story of the quiet foreign student who had defended himself and others against systematic harassment became part of Lincoln High's institutional memory, inspiring future generations of students to stand up for what was right while maintaining their own moral principles. Adrian Volkov's name would be remembered not as someone who had won fights, but as someone who had won the more important battle for dignity, justice, and the right of all students to attend school without fear. His father's teachings about Systema had emphasized that the ultimate victory came not from defeating opponents, but from avoiding unnecessary conflict while maintaining the ability to protect yourself and others when peaceful resolution proved impossible. Adrian's experience at Lincoln High had provided him with the opportunity to demonstrate those principles under the most challenging circumstances possible, and he had emerged with his character intact and his community improved by his presence. The transformation from victim to defender to protector was complete, but more importantly, Adrian had learned that real strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when force was truly necessary and the restraint to use only what was required to protect what was right. Those lessons would serve him well throughout his life, whether he was facing playground bullies or more serious threats to the people and principles he had sworn to defend.